So what exactly was the deal with the Middle Ages? Between knightly duels, church dramas, and plagues that probably gave the Grim Reaper a busy schedule, it's fair to say it was a complicated time. Some call it the Dark Ages, others romanticize it with chivalrous knights in shining armor. And believe it or not, it was both. However, the popular perception of the Middle Ages has always been a topic for discussion. It seems like every century or so, scholars decided to either romanticize the hell out of the Middle Ages or say it was literally the worst time to be alive. But why is that? Most of the controversy surrounding the Middle Ages stems from a narrow focus on Western and Central Europe. While countries like England, France, and Germany receive considerable attention, the rest of Europe, and indeed the world, remains out of the spotlight. This limited perspective neglects the fact that outside of Europe, from the Middle East to China, regions experienced relative stability and even flourishing periods during this time. But even if we look just at Europe, while the early Middle Ages were indeed a rough time, they were also a period of big changes and surprising accomplishments. Now, to expand on this point, let us start our medieval journey by examining where this debate started. The name itself, Middle Ages. I mean, that's a pretty bland way to label 1,000 years of history. It's like calling the Renaissance that time when we got into painting. But jokes aside, why do we even call it the Middle? Well, scholars wanted to separate it from their favorite eras. Ancient times, characterized by the Roman Empire, Greek philosophers, and big stone structures, then the Renaissance, with revival of classic works, astonishing paintings, and cooler statues. Now if you are thinking, wait, is that fair? Did they just name 1,000 years based on what came before and after? Yeah. And if Middle Ages wasn't unappealing enough, we've also got the Dark Ages. Probably the most insulting title given to a time period. Now if from these Dark Ages you're expecting a pitch black and mysterious time, you are half right. The term Dark Ages was first coined by Petrarch, the famous Italian poet and early humanist who liked to make things sound like they came straight out of a horror novel. He used the term primarily because there was a lack of literature and historical records from the early medieval period. So Petrarch was like, I can't see much, it's dark. As you can tell, it seems when it comes to naming historical eras, the Middle Ages didn't exactly get the coolest titles. But since it's called the Age of Enlightenment, it doesn't mean there was no darkness. Am I right, French Revolution? Anyway, now that we uncovered the unfortunate titles given to this era, let's talk about when the Middle Ages actually started. Since we know the Middle Ages falls between ancient Rome and the Renaissance, it seems logical that it all kicked off right when Rome fell. Right? Well, yeah. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 1476, it created a power vacuum that the Germanic tribes eagerly rushed to fill. These Germanic people formed their own kingdoms with new customs and laws that often blended Roman tradition with their own. So in a way, the Middle Ages started with a massive cultural mashup, a mix of Roman traditions and the rugged lifestyle of the Germanic tribes. One of the most powerful of these tribes were the Franks. And speaking of the Franks, it's time to talk about Charlemagne. You probably know the basics. He was a powerful Frankish king who eventually got crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor, mainly because the Pope missed the glory days of Rome and thought, hey, why not rekindle that whole church and state partnership? Talking about the Pope, let's take a look at the medieval church. After the fall of Rome, the church found itself encircled by pagan Germanic rulers, but gradually these German folks converted to Christianity, creating new opportunities for the church to extend its influence across medieval kingdoms. And Charlemagne, being a devout Catholic, was totally down for an alliance with the church, and this union of the church and the state eventually led to the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne essentially thought, let's bring some of that old civilization back. The Carolingian Renaissance was a period of cultural revival led by Charlemagne and the church. In fact, if it weren't for Charlemagne's efforts to preserve the works of classic antiquity, later Renaissance figures like Petrarch might not have had the chance to marvel at them at all. So I would for sure give a point to Charlemagne for that one. But following Charlemagne's death and some civil wars later, there was no sign of his united realm. The eastern part of Charlemagne's empire eventually fell to the Ottonians, a dynasty that actually knew how to rule. With the title of the Holy Roman Emperor gathering dust since Charlemagne's death, the Pope decided it was time to revive the whole Catholic Empire concept. And so he crowned Otto the Great as the Holy Roman Emperor. Think of Otto as the sequel to Charlemagne nobody really expected but everyone got. And just like Charlemagne, Otto was called Great for a reason. Before receiving his papal promotion, he inherited the kingship of his Francia from his father. and he set his sights on uniting the German tribes into one kingdom. Like his dad, Otto also wanted to reign in the dukes, whose power was starting to rival the king's. Eventually he pulled it off, and Otto's success not only stabilized his rule, but also laid the foundations for another mini-renaissance of his own, mirroring Charlemagne's achievements in a new era. Otto's patronage of art led to some surprising cultural achievements. Believe it or not, Roswitha, the first female historian and the first person since the fall of Rome to write dramas in the Latin West, was actually nurtured within Otto's court. As you can see, it seems that whenever a ruler managed to keep things relatively stable, people wasted no time diving into advancing their cultural identity. However, stability in the realm wasn't the Middle Ages' strong suit. Over the next few centuries, repeated disputes flared up between the Pope and the Emperor over who gets to appoint bishops. These clashes often spiraled into chaos and probably fed into why the Middle Ages have a reputation as a turbulent, even dismal era. Speaking of medieval's reputation, let's look at where most of it actually comes from: Western Europe. Dominated by the kingdoms of France and England, medieval Western Europe was a blend of impressive achievements and the inevitable chaos of medieval warfare. After the downfall of Charlemagne's descendants, the Capetian kings of France were desperately trying to expand their royal holdings beyond Paris, whilst their dukes held most of the power. You see, if the Italian city-states were the birthplace of the cultural bloom we call the Renaissance, then France was where the social and economic structure of feudalism truly took root and thrived. The more lands you controlled, the bigger was your army and the richer you were. However, feudalism as it happened wasn't exactly a recipe for long-lasting harmony. Each generation of kings and nobles pushed to outmaneuver the other, and out of these clashes emerged a need for some sort of a parliamentary government to balance the tensions. Speaking of the parliamentary governments, let's look at the other kingdom of Western Europe, England. England had been ruled by a mix of Viking and Anglo-Saxon kings till the mid-11th century. However, that was about to be changed thanks to another medieval superstar, William the Conqueror. Now, if the Middle Ages were a TV show, let's say that William and his hometown friends were the ones who spiced up season 2. You see, around the 9th century, a bunch of Vikings left Scandinavia, with some of them choosing to settle wherever there was a war to fight or a field to farm. Eventually, these Vikings became known as Norsemen, or as we call it today, Normans. A group of these Normans would settle in the northern parts of France, naming the Duchy of Normandy after themselves. Now, if you're wondering where does William fit into this narrative, I have to tell you that he was one of the Norman dukes of Normandy, who conquered England after the famous Battle of Hastings in 1066. His reign and that of his descendants would shape English history for centuries, leading to the establishment of parliamentary government following the Magna Carta, ongoing conflicts with France, and of course the notorious Wars of the Roses. Now it becomes easy to see why the Middle Ages can carry a negative connotation. When you think of medieval England, which most of English-speaking people do upon hearing the name Middle Ages, pictures of Viking raids, endless wars with France, and brutal family feuds are what often come to mind. Compared to the cultural golden age of the Tudors, the medieval era appears to offer very little in terms of art and literature. However, this perception of the English Middle Ages that has become a stereotype for how we see this era doesn't really resonate with me. Sure, there were wars, but there was also a long list of advancements made by medieval societies all across Europe. England and France, for instance, are the two countries from which much of this partly mythical and tumultuous reputation originates. However, as I mentioned earlier, the dominant social structure of feudalism in these kingdoms not only fostered a gradual yet steady shift towards parliamentary government, but also spurred significant advancement in agriculture. And by the 12th century, another cultural wave swept across Europe. The Renaissance of the 12th century led to the development of Gothic architecture, the establishment of medieval universities, the revival of poetry, and the early rediscoveries of classic literature. To sum up, it's clear that the significant achievements of medieval people are often eclipsed by the darkness that have shaped our perception of this era. I didn't even get to dive into the rich cultural melting pot of Iberia, the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, or the resilient Byzantine Empire. But even with these stories untold, the Middle Ages reveal a time of profound change, adaptation, and progress. While knights clashed and plagues swept through the land, it's essential to remember that the Middle Ages were also a time of profound change and remarkable achievement. The period often deemed dark was in fact a vibrant tapestry woven with cultural revival, intellectual growth, and a slowly evolving social structure. From the Carolingian and Ottonian Renaissances to the architectural marvels of Gothic cathedrals and the establishment of universities, the Middle Ages laid crucial groundwork for achievements that followed. Yes, it was a time marked by conflict, but it was also an era that sowed the seeds of modern governance and cultural flourishing. After all, history is rarely as simple as it seems, and the Middle Ages are no exception. And that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.